How does a kingdom survive when its greatest enemy is growing stronger every year, while its king is slowly dying? In the late 12th century, that question hung over the kingdom of Jerusalem like a storm cloud. To understand Baldwin IV, we first need to understand the world he inherited, because his story did not begin with disease. It began nearly a century earlier, in blood. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II called upon Western European Christians to march east. His speech would become one of the most consequential in medieval history. Different people heard different messages. Some nobles saw land and opportunity. Some knights sought glory. Some peasants believed they were serving God. Others hoped to escape death, poverty, or political troubles. Religion mattered, but human motives are rarely simple. 4 years later, in July 1099, Crusader armies reached Jerusalem. What followed remains one of the most controversial episodes of the Crusades. Contemporary chroniclers, including some Crusader writers themselves, described widespread killing after the city fell. Muslims were killed, Jews were killed, many civilians were caught in the violence. Medieval warfare was often brutal, regardless of religion. But even by the standards of the age, the fall of Jerusalem left deep scars. For many Christians in Europe, it was seen as a miraculous victory. For much of the Muslim world, it became a memory of conquest and humiliation. Those memories would not disappear. They would survive for generations. And one day, a young Muslim commander named Saladin would grow up hearing them. Crusaders established several states in the Levant. The most important was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At first, these states appeared surprisingly successful. European knights controlled cities, castles, and trade routes, stretching along parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Italian merchants from places such as Venice and Genoa profited from commerce. Pilgrims arrived from Europe. New castles rose over strategic roads and hills. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a problem. The Crusader states were always outnumbered. A Frankish knight could travel for days through territories where most people spoke Arabic, Armenian, Greek, or Syriac. Many local Christians lived alongside Muslims and Jews. The rulers were European. The population often was not. This created a fragile balance, and it raised an uncomfortable question. Could a relatively small foreign elite permanently rule a region where it remained a minority? For decades, no one knew the answer. Meanwhile, the Muslim world was also divided. Modern people sometimes imagine that the Crusaders faced a united Islamic front. The reality was far more complicated. Different dynasties competed with one another. Regional rulers pursued their own interests. Cities rivaled cities. Ambition often mattered as much as faith. This fragmentation helped the Crusader states survive, but it would not last forever. Into this world was born Saladin around 1137 or 1138, probably in Tikrit. His family was Kurdish. His father served military rulers in the region. Unlike the image many people have of him today, Saladin did not begin as a legendary conqueror. He grew up in a world of political intrigue, shifting alliances, and military competition. As a young man, he studied religion and administration as well as warfare. Contemporaries often described him as intelligent, disciplined, and patient, qualities that would later prove more dangerous than simple bravery. By the 1160s and early 1170s, Saladin was rising rapidly. Egypt, one of the wealthiest regions in the eastern Mediterranean, came under his control. Soon he became the dominant power in both Egypt and much of Syria. For the first time in decades, a single leader was beginning to untie large parts of the Muslim Near East. In Jerusalem, many nobles understood what this meant. A fragmented enemy was becoming organized. A temporary problem was becoming an existential threat. But another crisis was already emerging, this time inside the royal palace itself. In 1161, a boy named Baldwin was born into the royal family of Jerusalem. No one expected him to become famous. No one expected him to become a symbol. And certainly, no one expected him to become one of Saladin's most formidable opponents. As a child, Baldwin was educated by one of the most important historians of the age, William of Tyre. William was not merely a tutor, he was a scholar, diplomat, churchman, and observer of politics. His writings would later become one of the most valuable sources for understanding the Crusader kingdoms. One day, William noticed something strange. While other boys played rough games, Baldwin seemed unable to feel pain in parts of his arm. At first, this may not have appeared alarming. Children get injured. Children behave oddly. But the symptoms persisted. Gradually, the truth became difficult to ignore. The prince was showing signs of leprosy. Today, historians generally identify the illness as Hansen's disease. At the time, however, the diagnosis carried enormous fear. People did not fully understand the disease. Many viewed it with religious, social, and cultural anxiety, and unlike a broken bone or a fever, this was not something expected to heal. For the nobles of Jerusalem, the implications were terrifying. The kingdom faced an increasingly powerful enemy. Its future king suffered from a progressive illness, and every year would make that illness worse. A kingdom surrounded by enemies needed a warrior king. So why was Baldwin still the heir? Why did powerful nobles not simply replace him? Part of the answer lay in dynastic legitimacy, part lay in politics, and part lay in the simple reality that no alternative promised greater stability. Removing him might create a succession crisis before his reign even began. Keeping him meant gambling on time. Neither option was comfortable. In 1174, Baldwin became king at just 13 years old. The same year, Saladin's influence was expanding dramatically across the Muslim world. A Sikh teenage king, a rising military genius, a shrinking Christian kingdom, a growing Muslim coalition. The contrast seemed almost unfair. Many observers might have predicted the outcome already. Yet history has a habit of surprising those who believe they know how a story ends, because the young king, whose hands were slowly losing sensation, was about to lead armies against one of the most famous commanders of the medieval world, and the first great test would come sooner than anyone expected. By 1174, the balance of power in the Levant seemed to be shifting in one direction. Every year, Saladin grew stronger. Every year, Baldwin IV grew weaker. One was building an empire, the other was losing his body. If history followed logic alone, the outcome should have been obvious. But battlefields rarely obey logic. When Baldwin inherited the throne at 13 years old, the kingdom of Jerusalem was facing problems on every front. Its population was relatively small. Its nobility was divided by rivalries. Its economy depended heavily on trade routes, pilgrimage traffic, taxation, and support from Europe. The kingdom possessed impressive castles and experienced knights, but it lacked one crucial advantage: manpower. Saladin could often draw from far larger populations across Egypt and Syria. Jerusalem could not. To understand why Saladin became such a threat, we need to understand what he was actually building. Many rulers before him had spoken about unity. Saladin achieved part of it. By the mid-1870s, Egypt's wealth flowed into his military system. The fertile Nile Valley generated taxes, grain, and resources. Meanwhile, Syria provided strategic depth, manpower, and access to key cities such as Damascus and Aleppo. For the first time since the First Crusade, many Muslims began to see the possibility of coordinated resistance against the Crusader states. But Saladin's motives were not purely religious. Like many rulers throughout history, he sought legitimacy, security, prestige, and political authority. Victory over the Crusader kingdoms would provide all four. Meanwhile, Baldwin faced challenges much closer to home. His disease was advancing. Leprosy attacked nerves and reduced sensation. In medieval society, this was terrifying, not only because of physical decline, but because kings were expected to embody strength. A ruler unable to ride, fight, or command could quickly lose authority. So how could Baldwin maintain power while his body betrayed him? The answer lay partly in personality and partly in necessity. The kingdom simply could not afford a weak monarchy. Contemporary accounts suggest Baldwin developed a reputation for determination and courage. Even critics acknowledged his resilience. The medieval world respected strength, and Baldwin repeatedly demonstrated that he still possessed it. Yet there was another problem. A king can inspire troops. A king cannot personally be everywhere. Who would actually help defend Jerusalem? The military structure of the Crusader states relied on several groups. The feudal nobility supplied mounted knights. Religious military orders provided professional warriors. Among the most famous were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These men combined religious vows with military service. To many Europeans, they were defenders of Christendom. To many Muslims, they represented the armed edge of Crusader expansion. Like most institutions in history, their reputation depended on who was telling the story. Saladin's forces were equally complex. His armies included professional cavalry, regional contingent, Kurdish troops, Turkish horse archers, Arab soldiers, and volunteers motivated by both faith and opportunity. Mobility was one of their greatest strengths. Unlike many European armies, which often depended heavily on heavily armored shock cavalry, Saladin's forces excelled at maneuver warfare, harassment, encirclement. attrition, patience. These methods had frustrated Crusader armies before, and they would do so again. Then came 1177, one of the most remarkable moments in Baldwin's life. Saladin launched a major campaign into the kingdom of Jerusalem. Many Crusader forces were scattered. The kingdom appeared vulnerable. Some Muslim commanders expected a relatively straightforward operation. The odds favored Saladin. So why is the Battle of Montgisard remembered at all? Because reality refused to follow expectations. In November 1177, near Battle of Montgisard, Baldwin gathered a much smaller force. Estimates vary, but most historians agree the Crusaders were heavily outnumbered. The young king, already suffering from leprosy, rode with his army. The battle developed rapidly. Crusader heavy cavalry launched a devastating attack before Saladin's army could fully organize. The result shocked contemporaries. Saladin suffered one of the worst defeats of his career. Many of his forces escaped, but the campaign itself collapsed. The victory spread throughout the Christian world. To supporters of Baldwin, it seemed almost miraculous. To Muslim chroniclers, it was a painful setback. Yet, even among Saladin's admirers, defeat did not destroy his reputation. In fact, some historians argue it strengthened him. Because great commanders often learn more from failure than success. The Muslim scholar and later biographer Bahauddin Shaddad would describe Saladin as a ruler capable of persistence after setbacks. And persistence mattered, because Montgisard did not end the conflict. It merely delayed its next chapter. At the same time, ordinary people experienced these wars very differently than kings and generals. A peasant near Jerusalem worried about crops. A merchant worried about caravan routes. A Muslim family in Syria feared raids. A Christian family feared invasion. Most people did not spend their days discussing grand strategy. They worried about survival. War disrupted markets, destroyed harvests, raised taxes, and forced young men into military service. The ambitions of rulers often became burdens for ordinary families. Around this time, the famous Persian poet Nizami Ganjavi was writing works that reflected themes of power, fate, and human ambition. Although not directly describing Baldwin and Saladin, his writings captured a truth visible across the medieval world. The world is a mountain, and our deeds are the echoes. Every victory created consequences. Every defeat created opportunities. And neither Baldwin nor Saladin had reached the decisive chapter of their story. For all the glory of Montgisard, one reality remained unchanged. Saladin was still alive. His empire was still growing, and Baldwin's disease was still advancing. The king had won the battle everyone thought he would lose, but another question now emerged. Could he preserve the kingdom long enough to survive the politics inside Jerusalem itself? Because sometimes the greatest danger to a kingdom does not come from beyond its borders. Sometimes it waits inside the royal court. There is a cruel irony in Baldwin's story. The man who repeatedly frustrated Saladin's ambitions was not defeated on the battlefield. He was defeated by time, and time was the one enemy he could never charge with a cavalry attack. By the early 1180s, Baldwin IV was in his 20s. but his body was falling rapidly. Leprosy had progressed far beyond the symptoms noticed by William of Tyre during childhood. Contemporary accounts described increasing blindness, loss of mobility, difficulty writing, difficulty governing. Yet, despite his condition, Baldwin remained deeply involved in political and military affairs. His determination impressed even some of his critics. But admiration could not solve Jerusalem's greatest problem. The kingdom needed a future king, and that question threatened to divide the entire realm. The nobles of Jerusalem did not all agree on what should happen next. Powerful families formed rival factions. Personal ambitions mixed with genuine concerns for the kingdom. Some wanted stability, others wanted influence. Many wanted both. Medieval politics rarely separated principle from self-interest. The succession question became increasingly urgent, and every discussion carried an uncomfortable reality. Everyone knew Baldwin was dying. Among the most controversial figures was Guy of Lusignan. Through marriage and political alliances, Guy moved closer to power. Baldwin himself appears to have developed doubts about him. Some contemporaries questioned Guy's judgment and leadership. Others supported him. The kingdom was becoming divided at precisely the moment unity was most needed. Meanwhile, Saladin was learning from experience. The crushing setback at Montgisard had not broken him, it had educated him. Throughout the 1180s, he continued consolidating authority across Syria and Egypt. He improved coordination among his terrorists, expanded resources, strengthened alliances, and perhaps most importantly, he waited. Patience is often less dramatic than victory, but sometimes it is more effective. The historian Stephen Runciman later observed that Saladin possessed something many rivals lacked: the ability to think beyond individual battles. He understood that kingdoms often collapse from accumulated pressure rather than a single defeat. And pressure was building. By this point, ordinary people throughout the region had spent generations living with war. Christian farmers, Muslim traders, Jewish communities, Armenian craftsmen, Greek merchants. Most had little control over the decisions of kings, yet they paid the price. Trade routes became dangerous, taxes increased, harvests were disrupted, military campaigns consumed resources. While chroniclers focused on rulers and battles, ordinary families focused on survival. Then another problem emerged. One man began pushing the fragile peace toward catastrophe. His name was Raynald of Châtillon. Few figures of the Crusader era remain as controversial. To admirers, he was bold. To critics, reckless. To many Muslim chroniclers, he embodied the worst aspects of Crusader aggression. Raynald repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans and violated truces. These actions carried economic consequences as well as political ones. Caravans were not merely merchants. They were arteries of trade, connecting cities, rulers, and populations. Attacking them threatened both wealth and prestige. Saladin increasingly viewed Raynald as a direct challenge, but there was a larger issue. If agreements could not be trusted, then diplomacy became difficult. And if diplomacy failed, war became more likely. In 1185, Baldwin IV died at only 24 years old. The leper king was gone. For years he had acted as a stabilizing force within an unstable kingdom. His death created a vacuum, and vacuums rarely remain empty for long. The succession crisis intensified. Political rivalries deepened. Leadership became less coherent. Saladin noticed, so did everyone else. A kingdom that once possessed a determined and capable ruler now appeared increasingly fractured, and for the first time in many years, the balance of power seemed clearly titled. 2 years later came the turning point, the Battle of Hattin. If Montgisard represented Baldwin's greatest triumph, Hattin represented the collapse of much that he had struggled to preserve. The Crusader army marched under difficult conditions: summer heat, limited water, poor strategic positioning. Saladin exploited these weaknesses masterfully. His forces surrounded and exhausted the Crusader army before delivering the decisive blow. The result was catastrophic. Many leading nobles were captured. Military strength evaporated. The road to Jerusalem opened. The medieval Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Asir described the victory as one of the greatest moments in Islamic history. For much of the Muslim world, it felt like the reversal of generations of humiliation dating back to 1099. The memory of the First Crusade had never disappeared, neither had memories of the massacre that followed Jerusalem's capture. History often preserves wounds longer than victories. After Hattin, Saladin advanced toward Jerusalem. In October 1187, the city surrendered. And here we encounter one of the most discussed moments of Saladin's legacy. Unlike the mass killing that accompanied the Crusader capture of Jerusalem in 1099, Saladin allowed many inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave. This does not mean the conquest was bloodless. Wars never are. People lost homes, families were separated. Many entered captivity, yet, compared with the events of 1099, contemporary observers noted a striking difference in scale and treatment. The contrast became an important part of Saladin's reputation in both Eastern and Western historical memory. The French writer Amin Maalouf, in The Crusader Through Arab Eyes, later argued that many events remembered as glorious in Europe were remembered very differently in the Islamic world. Perspective matters. One side's liberation may be another side's conquest. One side's hero may be another side's enemy. History is rarely experienced from only one viewpoint, and so Jerusalem changed hands. The city that had defined the Crusader kingdom was no longer under Crusader rule. Yet Saladin's victory did not end the story. In fact, it ensured that a new chapter would begin. Across Europe, news of Jerusalem's fall spread rapidly. Kings who had spent years competing with one another suddenly faced a common shock. Popes preached a new crusade. Nobles prepared armies. Merchants calculated opportunities. Ordinary believers mourned the loss of the holy city. Among those preparing for the struggle ahead was a king whose name would become inseparable from Saladin's, a warrior whose reputation would echo across Europe for centuries, a king remembered as much for his courage as for his ambition. But that is another story. For now, Baldwin's story ends where many great tragedies end, not with his defeat, but with the realization that he had been holding back forces larger than himself, a sick king, a fragile kingdom, a rising empire. For more than a decade, he delayed an outcome that many believed inevitable, and when he was gone, the clock he had been fighting against finally ran out. And as always, if you enjoyed today's journey, consider subscribing. There are many more stories waiting to be told.